When I first realized something had shifted, it wasn't dramatic or loud. There were no arguments or slamming doors, just a subtle unease that settled over our home, the kind of quiet that creeps in unnoticed, like the first chill of winter air seeping through closed windows, and it made me pause in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter, staring at the sunlight streaming across the tile, and I thought about the envelope tucked away in my drawer, the one containing the $20,000 I had saved quietly over the years, a sum I had accumulated in patience, careful budgeting, and countless small sacrifices, money that represented not only security, but a sense of personal agency, a quiet proof that I could provide for myself. And yet, as I reached for my coffee that morning, I noticed a subtle tension in his gaze, a shift in the way he spoke, the slight hesitation in his tone when discussing bills or purchases, and a cold realization began to creep in, that the safety I had so carefully built might no longer be my own, that trust, which I had assumed was unshakable, could be quietly undermined without a word, without confrontation. And the thought made my chest tighten, a low ache that spread quietly into my shoulders, into the rhythm of my heart. And I remembered the mornings I had counted pennies, the nights I had balanced checkbooks in silence, the afternoons I had declined little indulgences so I could save a portion of every paycheck, all for the hope of having something solid to hold on to, something unassailable. And yet in that very moment, I felt the fragility of even my most careful plans, the vulnerability of relying on trust without the assurance of communication. And as I walked to the living room, noticing the way he avoided my eyes, the slight stiffening when our topics brushed close to finances, I began to sense that the tension was more than just about money. It was about boundaries, respect, and the quiet erosion of partnership that occurs when one person assumes control without dialogue. And as I reflected, my mind drifted to past conversations, the gentle suggestions I had made that were brushed aside, the careful planning I had offered that went unacknowledged. And I felt the weight of invisibility pressing against me, not like anger, not like resentment, but as a quiet, aching disappointment, a realization that the care I had invested, the patience I had cultivated, and the quiet labor I had undertaken had all gone unnoticed in moments that now loomed larger than any sum of money could measure. And I began to consider the implications of what I sensed was coming, the ways in which trust, once breached, could ripple quietly through our life, altering the small interactions, the laughter, the shared routines, the very atmosphere of home. And I thought about my husband, about the man I had trusted with both heart and household, the shared responsibilities, the unspoken understandings, the life built together over years of care. And yet here was the subtle fracture, small but undeniable, hinting at a future where my quiet efforts might no longer hold the security they once did. And as these thoughts coalesced in my mind, I felt both fear and clarity, a recognition that the breach I sensed was imminent would test more than my finances. It would test my composure, my patience, my ability to respond not with impulsive reaction, but with measured thought. And I realized that this moment, seemingly ordinary in its morning calm, was the beginning of a journey that would force me to confront not just the movement of money, but the deeper currents of trust, autonomy, and emotional integrity in our life together. And as I sipped my coffee, feeling the warmth flow through my hands, I allowed myself to acknowledge the full scope of what was at stake. My sense of self, the balance of our partnership, the acknowledgement of effort long ignored, and the quiet, steady accumulation of patience and resilience that I had nurtured over years, all converging on the simple fact that $20,000 was not just a number, but a symbol, a representation of care, foresight, and the quiet strength I had cultivated in silence. And as I stared out the window at the morning sun catching the leaves on the trees, I felt a profound mixture of dread and resolve, knowing that whatever unfolded next would reveal not only the state of our finances, but the true depth of understanding, respect, and trust between us. And I felt the first tremor of the story that would carry through our household, a story that began with a simple realization, a subtle shift, and a quiet, almost imperceptible disturbance that would soon ripple outward, touching every aspect of our lives and demanding that I step forward with awareness, calm, and measured intent. And in that moment, I understood that the journey ahead would be both testing and revealing, a slow unveiling of truths long overlooked, a quiet challenge to my inner strength, patience, and ability to navigate the delicate intersection of love, partnership, and self-respect. And I allowed myself to take a deep breath, to center in the knowledge that I had faced challenges before, had exercised patience and clarity when it mattered most, and that this was yet another opportunity to bring awareness, reflection, and calm into a situation fraught with subtle tension. And as I felt the warmth of the sun, the rhythm of the house around me, and the weight of anticipation pressing gently into my chest, I realized that the hook of this story, the very beginning of its unfolding, was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, emotionally charged moment of recognition, the subtle awareness that the $20,000 I had saved in silence might no longer rest undisturbed. And with that awareness, the stage was set for the days, weeks, and decisions to come, a slow, reflective journey through conflict, trust, and the restoration of balance, all beginning with a quiet morning, a cup of coffee, and the knowledge that something fundamental shifted.
As the morning stretched on, I found myself moving through familiar routines with a strange awareness, a heightened attention to small details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way he shuffled papers on the counter, the way he lingered by the window, the subtle pause before he responded to my questions about bills or household matters. And each tiny hesitation felt like a signal, a quiet confirmation that the balance we had taken for granted was shifting. And I realized that this was not just about the $20,000 I had carefully set aside, it was about the deeper currents of communication, respect, and acknowledgement in our relationship. And as I reflected, a mixture of anxiety and resolve grew steadily inside me, a gentle pressure that urged me to consider not just the practical implications of missing money, but the emotional terrain that had allowed such a breach to occur in silence. And I thought back over the years, the countless moments in which I had quietly contributed to our household, managed responsibilities without complaint, saved meticulously while keeping peace, and how each small act had been an expression of care and foresight, an investment in security and trust. And yet, in this moment, the fragility of those investments became painfully clear, and I felt a quiet ache in my chest, a subtle but persistent pressure that reminded me how easily trust can be overlooked, how silently it can be eroded when communication fails. And I began to prepare myself internally, practicing the calm clarity I knew I would need to navigate the confrontation that felt inevitable, because anger or rash reaction would only compound the subtle fracture that had appeared. And I recalled the careful calculations, the night spent reviewing budgets, the compromises I had made, the sacrifices set aside without complaint, all culminating in the envelope that had represented both practical security and personal agency, now vulnerable to unpermitted movement. And I felt a slow but deep realization of how even small breaches can ripple through emotional life, affecting perception, partnership, and the sense of safety we hold within our relationships. And as the morning sun shifted across the room, casting gentle shadows on familiar furniture, I noticed how even the ordinary objects, the coffee cup I held, the table where we shared meals, the simple decor of our home, felt subtly altered by the tension beneath, as if the very atmosphere had absorbed the quiet, unspoken unrest. And I reflected on the lessons that patience and observation had taught me, that quiet strength is cultivated over time, that awareness and clarity provide the guidance to navigate moments of uncertainty, and that sometimes the most profound confrontations are not dramatic eruptions, but calm, deliberate exercises of recognition and communication. And as these thoughts coalesced, I felt the stirrings of determination, a measured readiness to engage with the truth of what had occurred, not in haste or emotion, but with composed awareness, because I had learned that the weight of reflection often carries more impact than the force of reaction. And I recognized that the coming days would test both our understanding and my own capacity for calm resilience, that the movement of money, though seemingly simple, represented a much larger question of partnership, trust, and acknowledgement. And I allowed myself to sit with the discomfort, to feel the ache of oversight, the quiet pressure of unspoken disrespect, and to let these emotions inform my next steps with thoughtful clarity. And as I glanced around the room, taking in the familiar sights of our life together, the photographs, the furniture, the objects accumulated over years, I realized that each of these items, the ordinary, held the imprint of shared care, effort, and attention, and that my quiet, deliberate work in saving, planning, and managing had been just as integral to our household as any visible task. And now, with the subtle breach revealed, the importance of acknowledgement, communication, and mutual respect became even more apparent, and I felt a sense of sober responsibility, a recognition that how I chose to respond would shape not only the immediate resolution, but the ongoing texture of our partnership, and that measured, reflective engagement would be essential to restoring both practical balance and emotional harmony. And as I thought about the coming conversations, the necessary articulation of feelings, boundaries, and expectations, I felt the quiet stirring of courage, grounded not in confrontation, but in clarity, patience, and awareness, knowing that the days ahead would require thoughtful observation, deliberate communication, and the willingness to navigate discomfort with calm, empathy, and dignity. And in this understanding, I also felt the first glimmers of hope, the subtle assurance that even after a breach, trust can be rebuilt, balance restored, and connection strengthened if approached with care, attention, and reflective intent. And as the hours passed, the house remained calm, outwardly ordinary, but within, I felt the tension of anticipation, the quiet weight of unspoken questions, the knowledge that our shared life would soon encounter an essential moment of reckoning. And I embraced this tension, allowing it to sharpen my awareness, focus my intentions, and prepare me to respond with measured thought. And I reflected on the years that had led to this moment, the countless small choices, sacrifices, and quiet investments that had made our life possible. And I felt gratitude for the strength I had cultivated, patience I have exercised, and clarity I had nurtured, knowing that these qualities would now guide me through the unfolding chapter. And as the day drew on, I found a subtle peace in preparation, a gentle focus on observing, reflecting, and understanding before acting, because the true power in moments of tension lies not in reaction, but in calm, deliberate engagement. And as I sipped the last of my coffee and let the warmth flow through me, I realized fully that the hook of this story, the very point at which everything began to shift, was not an explosion of conflict, but a quiet, emotionally charged awareness, a subtle recognition that the $20,000 I had saved in silence, the symbol of care and foresight, had been moved without my consent, and that this simple act carried deeper questions of trust, respect, and acknowledgement, setting the stage for the journey of reflection, confrontation, understanding, and eventual resolution that would define the chapters to come. And as I took a deep breath, feeling the calm before the storm, I understood that the power of the story lay in its subtle unfolding, in the slow, deliberate recognition of a breach, and the careful preparation to navigate it with clarity, patience, and quiet strength. and that the emotional current set in motion this morning would guide the narrative, the healing, and the eventual restoration of trust, respect, and mutual understanding in the days ahead.
Looking back now, I can see how much of our life together had been built on routines, habits, and shared understanding, the kind that often goes unnoticed until something disrupts it. And I remember our small home, the way sunlight poured through the living room windows in the morning, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the passage of ordinary but meaningful time. And I think about my husband, a man I had known for over 15 years, someone whose strengths and weaknesses I had come to understand and accept, the way he took pride in his work, the way he sometimes overlooked details that mattered to me. And yet, over the years, I had found ways to accommodate both his habits and my own, carving out space for patience, understanding, and mutual care. And I remember our children, the small joys and challenges of raising them, the way our mornings were filled with breakfast routines, school preparations, and brief but heartfelt exchanges, the laughter over spilled cereal, the hurried goodbyes at the door, and the small moments in which I felt the profound satisfaction of creating stability, love, and care in our home. And I also think about the quiet ways in which I contributed to our financial stability. Not in flashy or noticeable ways, but through careful budgeting, tracking bills, saving quietly, and managing the details that often go unseen. And it was in these small, deliberate efforts that I found a sense of agency and pride, a subtle assurance that I could provide for myself and contribute meaningfully to our shared life. And yet, as I reflect on those years, I also notice the slow accumulation of small tensions, the tiny misunderstandings that went unspoken, the moments when effort was taken for granted or overlooked, and how over time, those small lapses created subtle fissures in our partnership, not dramatic or explosive, but quietly influencing the way we interacted, the tone of our conversations, the feeling of being acknowledged. And I realized that the background of our life, the routines, the habits, the shared responsibilities, form both the foundation of comfort and the environment in which small oversights could fester. And I think about the conversations we had about finances, about household responsibilities, about the choices we made together, and how I sometimes felt my voice was soft or ignored, not out of malice, but out of habit, of unawareness, of differing priorities. And I remember the ways I compensated for those moments, the quiet adjustments, the little sacrifices, the careful management of tasks so that life flowed smoothly. And as I consider all of this, I recognize how much effort and thought had gone into maintaining a balance that often went unseen, and how much patience and observation had shaped my daily life. And I also recall our extended family, the in-laws, siblings, and the larger network that influenced our daily routines and expectations. And I remember the subtle pressures of navigating these relationships, the gentle negotiations, the need to be both accommodating and assertive, to maintain harmony while asserting boundaries. And I realized that these dynamics, though sometimes exhausting, also strengthened my awareness, empathy, and capacity to observe without immediate judgment, to understand the subtleties of interaction, and to navigate emotional complexities with care. And as I think about the children again, I see the small ways in which their lives mirrored the lessons I had learned, the importance of patience, observation, and quiet diligence. And I understand that my careful management of finances, including the envelope with $20,000, was part of that same life lesson, not only for me, but also as a model of responsibility and foresight. And as I reflect on the domestic environment, the shared spaces, the small comforts of home, the rituals that marked our days, I realize that these elements, though ordinary, carried profound significance, shaping both our emotional world and the practical functioning of our household. And I notice how even small moments, the shared morning coffee, the careful coordination of meals, the management of homework and extracurricular activities were imbued with meaning, the subtle expression of care, attention, and foresight. And as I consider these layers, I also think about my own personal journey, the quiet cultivation of strength, patience, and insight that allowed me to navigate daily life with composure, to manage responsibilities without complaint, and to create a sense of security for myself and my family. And I realized that the $20,000 saved quietly was a tangible representation of all of this effort, the culmination of small, consistent choices made over time, and the confidence it gave me in the knowledge that I had both contributed meaningfully and retained a measure of autonomy. And as I continue to reflect, I see how the patterns of our life, interwoven responsibilities, routines, small sacrifices, and shared joys, created both comfort and the potential for tension when assumptions or boundaries were overlooked. And I understand that the stage for the conflict that followed was not sudden or arbitrary, but had been quietly prepared by years of unnoticed effort, small misunderstandings,
and the delicate balance between care, expectation, and acknowledgement. And as I think about this, I recognize the importance of remembering the ordinary, the everyday, because it is in these moments, the unnoticed, the routine, and the habitual, that relationships are both nurtured and challenged, and that my journey through the forthcoming conflict would require the same careful observation, patience, and insight that had shaped all these ordinary years. And I felt a subtle, steadying confidence, knowing that my awareness, experience, and careful management of life's details had prepared me to engage with the challenges ahead, not in haste or anger, but with deliberate thought, calm reflection, and emotional resilience. And as I looked around our home, noticing the soft sunlight, the familiar furniture, the small details of our shared life, I felt a deep, quiet sense of grounding, an understanding that the foundation laid over years, through patience, care, and quiet effort, was both fragile and enduring, and that navigating the coming events would require attention, empathy, and thoughtful engagement, qualities I had spent years developing in silence. And as I sat with these reflections, I realized that the next steps, the confrontation, and the gradual resolution would not be solely about money, but about recognition, respect, and the quiet, steady work of maintaining balance in a shared life. And I felt a calm resolve, a preparedness to approach what was to come with both clarity and compassion, knowing that the ordinary routines, the small gestures, and the patient cultivation of awareness had already provided me with the tools I would need to navigate this moment with dignity, reflection, and the hope of restoring trust, respect, and partnership in our home. As I reflect further on those years, I remember the subtle patterns that shaped our household, the quiet routines that created rhythm and familiarity, and the small but significant ways we communicated without words, gestures of care that often went unnoticed, but grounded our days and reminded us of our connection. And I think about the many evenings spent coordinating schedules, the delicate balance of school, work, household tasks, and family responsibilities, where every small decision required negotiation, understanding, and often compromise. And I recall the countless instances when I quietly took on extra tasks, preparing meals ahead, making sure bills were organized, double-checking schedules, because I knew that maintaining stability was an ongoing effort, one that relied on observation, patience, and careful planning. And I realize now how much of my identity was intertwined with these acts. The pride in seeing things run smoothly, the quiet assurance that I was contributing meaningfully to the well-being of everyone in our home. And yet, with this reflection, I also noticed the ways in which my contributions were often invisible, overlooked, or taken for granted, not intentionally, but as part of the habitual flow of life where some roles, especially those quietly maintained, can fade into background. And I think about my husband again, about his strengths, his dedication to work, his love for the family, and the ways our personalities complemented each other, but also how differences in attention to detail and priorities created subtle gaps, moments when I felt the quiet weight of unacknowledged effort, and how these small gaps, though manageable, could quietly accumulate into tension, shaping the emotional texture of our life without dramatic conflict. And I also reflect on the children, the bright moments and the challenges, the pride in their accomplishments, the worry over their struggles, the everyday joys and frustrations of guiding them through school, friendships, and personal growth. And I see now that my careful saving of $20,000 was intertwined with all these responsibilities, a personal measure of control and foresight, a silent reassurance that I had created a safety net not just for emergencies, but as a personal confirmation that I could manage life's uncertainties with care, patience, and planning. And I remember the subtle ways I had communicated this to my husband, the small hints, the careful mentions of financial goals, the gentle reminders, and how over time, these efforts were sometimes overlooked or the responses were practical but devoid of acknowledgement, which left me feeling quietly invisible despite the tangible impact of my contributions. And as I recall these patterns, I also think about our larger family connections, the influence of in-laws, siblings, and the larger network that influenced our daily routines and expectations. And I remember the subtle pressures of navigating these relationships, the gentle negotiations, the need to be both accommodating and assertive, to maintain harmony while asserting boundaries. And I realized that these dynamics, though sometimes exhausting, also strengthened my awareness, empathy, and capacity to observe without immediate judgment, to understand the subtleties of interaction, and to navigate emotional complexities with care. And as I think about specific family gatherings, the conversations around holidays, birthdays, and milestones, the way small comments revealed deeper patterns of interaction, subtle favoritism, or overlooked effort, and how I often found myself mediating, negotiating, or smoothing tensions to maintain peace, all while quietly sustaining my own sense of self and responsibility. And I remember moments of joy and pride as well. The laughter around the dinner table, the shared stories, the sense of continuity and belonging that arose from these rituals, and how these moments coexisted with the quiet accumulation of tension that sometimes went unnoticed, yet shaped the undercurrent of our household atmosphere. And I understand now that these early patterns of observation, patience, and subtle negotiation were preparation for the more explicit tests of trust and respect that awaited, that the way I had managed routines, communication, and finances would inform how I navigated moments of conflict with awareness and composure. And I also reflect on my own personal growth during these years.
The development of patience, careful observation, and emotional regulation, learning when to speak and when to listen, when to assert boundaries and when to allow space, and how these skills became foundational not just for family management, but for navigating life's unexpected challenges. And I remember the quiet pride I felt when making small sacrifices, the satisfaction in watching plans succeed, the reassurance in knowing that careful attention, consistency, and foresight created stability. And I recognized that the $20,000 I saved was not simply about money, but about cultivating a sense of agency, foresight, and security, a tangible expression of the effort, thought, and care I had invested in all aspects of our shared life. And I also consider the emotional lessons embedded in these routines, patience, observation, foresight, empathy, and the importance of communication, because it was these qualities, cultivated over years, that allowed me to respond calmly, thoughtfully, and deliberately when the moment came that tested the boundaries of trust. And I think about the quiet evenings, the reflective moments, the times I sat alone considering our family dynamics, and how these periods of contemplation strengthened my awareness, deepened my empathy, and prepared me to manage both the practical and emotional challenges that would soon confront us. And as I recall the texture of our daily life, the laughter, the small frustrations, the shared responsibilities, the unspoken acknowledgement of effort, the subtle tensions, I see clearly how this environment, with all its ordinary moments and layered dynamics, set the stage for the central conflict, the quiet but profound disruption caused by the unpermitted movement of my savings. And I feel a deep understanding of how the careful cultivation of patience, observation, and foresight is essential in maintaining not just household stability, but emotional harmony, trust, and mutual respect. And as I consider all of this, I feel a steadying confidence, knowing that the groundwork of careful planning, silent effort, and attentive observation would guide me through the difficult decisions and conversations ahead, and that the lessons of these years, the cultivation of awareness, resilience, empathy, and measured response, would allow me to navigate the disruption not with impulsive reaction, but with calm, thoughtful engagement, ensuring that the eventual resolution would be guided by understanding, reflection, and the quiet strength built over a lifetime of careful attention to both practical and emotional life.
The first hints of tension appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow moving across a familiar room, and I noticed it in the slight hesitations in my husband's voice when discussing expenses, the way he occasionally lingered over bills as if weighing decisions quietly before speaking, and the faint tightening around his eyes when my questions brushed close to topics I had long considered private, small indicators that something had shifted in the dynamics of our household, and I began to pay closer attention to these patterns, watching for the moments when patience and understanding were required. And I felt a mixture of unease and determination, a quiet awareness that these subtle cues could escalate if left unaddressed. And I thought about the envelope with the $20,000 tucked away in my dresser, a tangible representation of my years of careful planning, saving, and thoughtful restraint, and how in the back of my mind it had become a silent measure of security, autonomy, and foresight. And I realized that even the best-laid plans could be vulnerable if the delicate threads of trust and communication were ignored. And over the following days, small tensions began to surface in everyday interactions, the kind that would have seemed trivial to anyone else but carried emotional weight for me. The way a passing comment about budgeting felt sharper than intended, the subtle sigh when I mentioned a necessary expense, or the quiet defensiveness when I sought clarification on a purchase. And I found myself reflecting on past moments where these patterns had appeared but were smoothed over by routine. Yet now, combined with the awareness of my savings and the silent investment I had made in our financial stability, the weight felt heavier. And I began to notice my own reactions, the quiet tightening in my chest, the small hesitations before speaking, the careful choice of words to avoid confrontation while still asserting my understanding. And I realized that the cumulative effect of these small tensions was beginning to shape the emotional climate of our home. subtle but unmistakable. And I also observed the children, how they sensed shifts in mood, how laughter was slightly restrained, how questions were answered with more care, how the ordinary rhythms of their days were influenced by the undercurrent of subtle stress. And I felt a growing responsibility to manage not just the practical outcomes, but the emotional texture, the way tension can ripple quietly and invisibly through relationships, shaping perceptions, reactions, and connections. And as I considered this, I also reflected on the past months, recalling instances where my husband's actions had begun to feel slightly out of alignment with the patterns of trust and transparency we had built. Moments when decisions about finances were made without discussion, when his explanations felt vague or dismissive, and how these small breaches, compounded by the significant amount of money I had saved in silence, created a growing sense of vulnerability, a quiet but persistent worry that the foundation of our partnership might be tested in ways I had not anticipated. And as these thoughts built in my mind, I noticed my own emotions intensifying, not in outward anger or dramatic display, but as a quiet ache of disappointment, subtle frustration, and apprehension, a gentle but insistent call to pay attention, reflect, and prepare for the conversations and decisions that would inevitably arise. And in the evenings, when the house was still and the children had gone to bed, I found myself revisiting these patterns, replaying interactions, analyzing tone, timing, and intent, considering how best to address these issues without escalation, and reflecting on how our shared life, so carefully built over years of mutual effort, patience, and compromise, could be influenced profoundly by even small lapses in communication, awareness, or respect. And I thought about my own responsibility to respond thoughtfully, to maintain composure, and to guide the resolution of these emerging tensions in a way that balanced practicality with emotional care. And I noticed how even minor misunderstandings, an overlooked text, a deferred discussion, a casual remark, carried weight when the emotional context was already strained. And I understood that the challenge ahead was as much about managing emotions and preserving trust as it was about the practical implications of money or household decisions. And as the days passed, the tension grew quietly, revealed in fleeting glances, careful word choices, and the subtle adjustment of daily routines, small but unmistakable indicators that our equilibrium was being tested. And I reflected on the lessons I had learned from years of managing both visible and invisible responsibilities, the cultivation of patience, empathy, observation, and resilience, knowing that these qualities would be essential in navigating the unfolding conflict. And I also became aware of the physical effects of this tension, the subtle tightening in my chest, the restless pacing during quiet moments, the careful monitoring of my own reactions, the need to maintain calm while processing a growing sense of unease. And I recognized that these responses were not weakness, but evidence of attentiveness, a deliberate engagement with the emotional reality of our household. And I began to plan, quietly and methodically, the steps I would take to address emerging concerns, to communicate clearly, and to safeguard both the practical and emotional balance of our life, because I understood that unaddressed tension, no matter how subtle, can escalate over time, creating rifts in trust, clarity, and mutual respect. And I felt a deep responsibility to act with both care and resolve, to prevent the quiet accumulation of stress from disrupting the foundation we had built. And as I reflected on all of this, I also considered my own growth, the ways in which years of careful attention, patience, and measured response had equipped me to handle not just financial discrepancies, but the emotional challenges that accompany them. And I felt a quiet, steadying confidence in my ability to navigate the path ahead, maintaining composure, clarity, and empathy, while also asserting the boundaries and recognition that had been silently compromised. And I noticed the small moments in daily life where these lessons were applied, the careful wording of a question, the measured response to a casual remark, the quiet observation of reactions, the deliberate choice to pause before responding, and all of which served to manage the tension without escalating conflict. And I realized that this was the heart of rising conflict. These subtle, accumulating pressures, the quiet realizations, and the delicate balance of observation, preparation, and thoughtful engagement, all of which would shape the unfolding of events in ways that were both profound and deeply personal. And as I navigated these days, the awareness of my savings, the recognition of my own diligence, and the anticipation of addressing the unpermitted movement of money created an emotional landscape that was complex, layered, and deeply instructive, preparing me for the turning points that were soon to come and grounding me in the qualities of patience, clarity, and measured resolve that would guide me through the challenges ahead. As the days progressed, the tension became more noticeable, though still quiet, like the subtle tremor before a storm, and I observed the small ways in which our household rhythm shifted, the careful avoidance at certain topics, the hesitation in casual conversation, the faint defensiveness that appeared in my husband's responses, and even the children seemed to sense a subtle unease, their laughter a little more restrained, questions asked a little more cautiously, and I realized that these small signals were cumulative, quietly shaping the emotional atmosphere of our home, and I felt the weight of responsibility, knowing that my response, patience, and composure would be critical in navigating this growing strain, and I reflected on the envelope of $20,000, how it represented not just money but years of careful planning, thought, and sacrifice, and the knowledge that it had been moved without my awareness intensified the sense of vulnerability and the subtle ache of disappointment, and I began to notice moments that previously would have seemed insignificant, now carrying emotional weight, such as the way he glanced at the bills, the hesitation in his voice, the slight defensiveness when I sought clarity, and I understood that these small behaviors were indicative of a larger tension building beneath the surface. And I also reflected on my own reactions, how I carefully measured my words, monitored my tone, and exercised patience, knowing that any rash response could escalate a situation already charged with emotional significance. And I felt a growing awareness of the delicate balance between asserting boundaries and maintaining harmony, the subtle navigation required to address a breach of trust without creating irreparable conflict. And I noticed the ways in which my husband, unaware of the full depth of my observation, continued to act within patterns of habit, small oversights and unspoken assumptions that were now magnified by the emotional importance of the savings. And I felt a quiet but persistent tension, a mix of anxiety, disappointment, and determination, knowing that the coming days would require clarity, honesty, and deliberate engagement. And I began to prepare, not with anger or accusation, but with careful reflection, considering how best to communicate my feelings, establish acknowledgement, and reclaim both practical control and emotional balance. And I reflected on the years we had shared, the countless small sacrifices, the patient negotiation of routines, responsibilities, and family dynamics. And I realized that these experiences had built resilience, insight, and emotional intelligence that would now guide my responses. And I observed the children again, noticing the subtle ways in which they mirrored our emotional state, how moods, tensions, and the faint undercurrent of conflict affected their behavior. And I felt a responsibility not just for resolving practical matters, but for maintaining a sense of stability, safety, and calm in the home. And as the tension built, I also reflected on my own internal dialogue, the quiet rehearsals of conversations, the careful weighing of words, tone, and timing, the preparation for confrontation that was neither harsh nor reactive, but deliberate, measured, and emotionally informed. And I understood that these preparations were essential, for the breach represented not just a practical challenge, but a deeper question of trust, respect, and acknowledgement in our partnership. And I began to notice the ways in which small interactions now carried magnified meaning, the casual mention of an expense, the hesitation before responding to questions, the slight defensiveness when I sought clarity. And I understood that these small behaviors were indicative of a larger tension building beneath the surface. And I understood that these preparations were essential, for the breach represented not just a practical challenge, but a deeper question of trust, respect, and acknowledgement in our partnership. And I began to notice the ways in which small interactions now carried magnified meaning, the casual mention of an expense, the hesitation before responding to questions, the slight defensiveness when I sought clarity. And I recognized that these were signals requiring calm attention, observation, and thoughtful response. And as the days passed, I felt the growing importance of maintaining emotional equilibrium, the conscious effort to process disappointment without letting it dictate my actions, and to respond with clarity, composure, and purpose. Because I knew that the impact of this breach of trust extended beyond the immediate financial concern to the ongoing dynamics of partnership, communication, and mutual respect. And I reflected on the importance of perspective, the value of patience, and the lessons embedded in years of careful observation and measured response. And I recognized that this rising conflict was not only about the money, but about acknowledgement, respect, and the subtle, essential work of maintaining harmony. And I began to see the situation with increasing clarity, understanding both the practical implications and the emotional currents at play, and how my careful attention, silent observation, and readiness for deliberate engagement would shape the outcome. And I observed my own resilience, the quiet strength that had been cultivated over years of managing household responsibilities, finances, and emotional dynamics. And I felt a sense of preparedness, not fueled by confrontation, but grounded in understanding, reflection, and careful planning.
and I began to anticipate the pivotal moment when clarity, honesty, and calm would be necessary, preparing myself to navigate the discussion thoughtfully, ensuring that my points would be communicated effectively, that boundaries would be respected, and that the emotional and practical consequences could be addressed with composure. And I also reflected on the small victories and patterns of patience that had prepared me for this, the quiet lessons embedded in ordinary days and unnoticed effort, in the cultivation of foresight, empathy, and clarity. And I realized that these qualities would now be tested, revealing both strengths and areas needing careful attention. And as I considered the days ahead, I felt the growing emotional complexity, the subtle mix of apprehension, determination, and quiet resolve, knowing that the rising tension was both inevitable and manageable, requiring deliberate, thoughtful, and emotionally informed engagement. And I observed how every small action, word, or gesture now carried amplified meaning, how the weight of unspoken expectations, breached trust, and years of care intersected in each interaction. And I understood that navigating this effectively would require all the patience, clarity, and insight I had cultivated. And as I prepared, I also felt the quiet lessons of resilience, observation, and foresight guiding me, reinforcing the importance of measured, deliberate action and emotional integrity. And I recognized that the resolution of this conflict, when it arrived, would be shaped as much by the way I managed rising tensions, interpreted cues, and prepared to communicate, as by the practical facts themselves. And I allowed myself to acknowledge both the emotional strain and the opportunity for growth, understanding that rising conflict, though uncomfortable, is also the space where clarity, resolution, and understanding are cultivated, and that my preparedness, reflection, and calm composure would be central to navigating the turning point with dignity, insight, and strength.
The moment of realization arrived quietly, without fanfare, yet it carried the weight of years of unnoticed effort, preparation, and silent contribution. And I remember the afternoon as vividly as if it were yesterday, the way sunlight slanted through the blinds, casting lines across the living room floor, the subtle hum of the refrigerator in the background, and the faint ticking of the clock marking each second that seemed to stretch endlessly. As I opened the envelope that I had always kept tucked safely away, only to discover that the $20,000 I had carefully saved over months of disciplined planning and quiet restraint had been moved without my consent. And in that instant, a mixture of disbelief, hurt, and confusion washed over me, not in a sudden explosion of anger, but as a deep, quiet ache, the recognition that trust, once assumed, had been breached. And I felt the subtle tremor of my own vulnerability, the awareness that my efforts, my careful management, and my silent foresight had been disregarded. And I remember the way my hands trembled slightly as I set the envelope down and allowed myself a few moments to absorb the reality of what had occurred, reflecting on the patterns, choices, and decisions that had led to this point. And I noticed the shift in the emotional temperature of the room, the quiet tension, the way the ordinary rhythms of our life had been altered in a single silent act. And I thought about my husband, sitting across from me, seemingly unaware of the full impact of his actions, and I felt the quiet pull of disappointment, a deep, reflective sorrow that comes not from dramatic betrayal alone, but from the realization that something carefully nurtured, valued, and safeguarded had been disregarded. And I recalled the years of effort, the meticulous tracking of finances, the patient balancing of household responsibilities, and how this act of moving the savings without discussion was more than a financial breach. It was a disruption of the trust, respect, and acknowledgement that had underpinned our shared life. And as I processed these feelings, I also noticed the subtle ways in which the children were affected, the quiet glances exchanged, the sudden attentiveness, the faint pause in their activities as if sensing that a fundamental shift had occurred. And I understood that the ramifications of this act extended beyond money alone, reaching into the emotional fabric of our family, challenging the assumptions, routines, and silent agreements that had long structured our life together. And I reflected on my own responses, how years of careful observation and emotional regulation guided me to remain composed, to refrain from immediate confrontation, and to approach the situation with deliberate thought, acknowledging the depth of the hurt while preparing for a conversation that would need clarity, firmness, and calm. And I remember the subtle dialogue that followed, the careful words exchanged, my voice steady but carrying the weight of disappointment and expectation, and the way my husband responded, initially with confusion, then defensiveness, and finally, gradual recognition of the significance of his actions. And I noticed how this moment illuminated not only the fragility of trust, but also the importance of acknowledgement, transparency, and communication in sustaining relationships. And I reflected on how often small acts of disregard, even when unintentional, can accumulate, eroding the quiet but essential bonds that hold shared life together. And I felt the profound emotional lesson embedded in this event, the understanding that patience, observation, foresight, and clear communication are not only practical tools, but essential components of emotional security. And as I continued to process the situation, I realized that my feelings,
Hurt, disappointment, subtle fear were natural responses to a breach that challenged my sense of agency, respect, and contribution. And I allowed myself to acknowledge the pain, to sit with it, to recognize it as valid, while also preparing to engage thoughtfully, not reactively, and to guide the resolution with care, clarity, and emotional integrity. And I reflected on how this moment was a turning point, not only in terms of the immediate conflict about money, but in revealing deeper patterns, the ways in which trust, respect, and acknowledgement are intertwined with both practical and emotional dimensions of shared life. And I considered the broader implications, how the breach forced a confrontation with assumptions, habits, and unspoken expectations that had quietly shaped our interactions for years. And I felt a mixture of sorrow and clarity, recognizing both the fragility and resilience of the relationships I valued most. And as I prepared for the conversations and decisions that would follow, I drew on the patience, foresight, and emotional awareness that had been cultivated over years, understanding that navigating this turning point would require measured communication, deliberate action, and calm reflection. And I also reflected on the children, how witnessing this moment and the responses to it would shape their understanding of trust, respect, and handling difficult situations. And I recognized the responsibility I carried in modeling composure, clarity, and integrity, even while experiencing hurt, disappointment, and vulnerability. And I allowed myself to explore the emotional landscape fully. The ache of betrayal, the quiet fear of further disregard, the simmering frustration of unseen effort, and the determination to address the situation thoughtfully, without haste, anger, or escalation. And I noticed the subtle nuances in my husband's demeanor, the flicker of awareness, the softening of tone, the tentative acknowledgement of impact. And I realized that this moment, though painful, also offered an opportunity for growth, reflection, and reestablishment of trust, provided that the conversation was approached with care, honesty, and measured clarity. And as I continued to process, I reflected on the long arc of our shared life, the years of quiet effort, mutual care, small sacrifices, and patient management of daily routines, and how these foundations, though tested, still offered a platform from which to rebuild acknowledgement, respect, and understanding. And I allowed myself a quiet confidence, grounded not in certainty of outcome, but in the awareness of my own capacity to respond thoughtfully, empathetically, and with emotional integrity. And I began to prepare, both mentally and emotionally, for the pivotal dialogue, the careful unpacking of actions, expectations, and impacts, knowing that this turning point would require the full measure of reflection, patience, and deliberate engagement that I had cultivated over a lifetime of attentive, measured, and caring participation in our shared life. And I acknowledged the depth of emotion that the breach had triggered: hurt, disappointment, vulnerability, and subtle fear, while also recognizing the opportunity to navigate this moment with clarity, composure, and insight. And I felt a quiet resolve, a determination to face the challenge with honesty, thoughtfulness, and measured action, understanding that the resolution, though difficult, could restore both practical order and emotional balance if approached with care, patience, and deliberate communication. And as I sat in that quiet afternoon, absorbing the significance of what had occurred, I recognized the turning point not just as a crisis over money, but as a profound emotional lesson about trust, respect, acknowledgement, and the careful cultivation of shared life. And I allowed myself a quiet confidence, grounded not in certainty of outcome, but in the awareness of my own capacity to respond thoughtfully, empathetically, and with emotional integrity. And I began to prepare, both mentally and emotionally, for the pivotal dialogue, the careful unpacking of actions, expectations, and impacts, knowing that this turning point would require the full measure of reflection, patience, and deliberate engagement that I had cultivated over a lifetime of attentive, measured, and caring participation in our shared life. And I acknowledged the depth of emotion that the breach had triggered: hurt, disappointment, vulnerability, and subtle fear, while also recognizing the opportunity to navigate this moment with clarity, composure, and insight. And I felt a quiet resolve, a determination to face the challenge with honesty, thoughtfulness, and measured action, understanding that the resolution, though difficult, could restore both practical order and emotional balance if approached with care, patience, and deliberate communication.
And as I sat in that quiet afternoon, absorbing the significance of what had occurred, I recognized the turning point not just as a crisis over money, but as a profound emotional lesson about trust, respect, acknowledgement, and the careful cultivation of shared life. And I allowed myself to settle into the understanding that measured, thoughtful response, grounded in emotional awareness and years of experience, would guide the path forward, shaping the eventual resolution, restoring clarity, and reaffirming the importance of patience, observation, and deliberate engagement in navigating the most difficult moments of life together. As the days following the discovery unfolded, the emotional weight of the breach settled into every corner of our household, a quiet but persistent presence that required attention, reflection, and careful navigation. And I noticed the subtle ways in which both my husband and I adjusted to the new reality, the small pauses before speaking, the careful choice of words, the gentle attempts at reassurance and explanation. And I realized that this turning point was not merely about the movement of $20,000, but about the deeper currents of trust, communication, and acknowledgement that had always underpinned our partnership. And I reflected on how such a seemingly practical act could resonate so profoundly in the emotional fabric of a relationship, revealing vulnerabilities, assumptions, and patterns of behavior that had long been present but unnoticed. And I observed the children again, how they sensed the tension, the shift in tone, and the subtle recalibration of our interactions. And I understood that even quiet conflict has ripples that extend beyond the immediate parties, affecting those who share the space, the rhythms, and the trust of the household. And I felt a mixture of sorrow and clarity, acknowledging both the hurt caused by the breach and the opportunity it presented to confront unspoken dynamics, to restore recognition, and to reaffirm boundaries, respect, and shared responsibility. And I remembered the careful conversations that followed, how I approached my husband not with anger or blame, but with measured honesty, expressing the depth of my feelings, the significance of my efforts, and the need for acknowledgement, clarity, and shared responsibility. And I noticed the gradual shift in his demeanor from initial defensiveness to tentative understanding, and then to quiet acknowledgement of the oversight. And in those moments, I realized the power of calm, thoughtful engagement, the way measured, emotionally informed communication can create space for recognition, understanding, and ultimately repair. And I reflected on my own internal landscape during these days, the quiet processing of disappointment, the careful balancing of patience, composure, and assertiveness, and the deliberate attention to emotional integrity, all of which guided me through what could have been a volatile situation into one that was reflective, communicative, and constructive. And I considered the broader implications of this turning point, how trust, respect, and acknowledgement are maintained not through the absence of mistakes, but through the conscious, deliberate response to challenges, and how these moments of rupture can illuminate underlying patterns, offering both insight and opportunity. And I observed the practical aspects as well, the careful discussion of finances, the reestablishment of boundaries around savings, and the agreement to communicate more transparently going forward. And I noticed the emotional shifts that accompanied these discussions, the subtle relief, the gradual restoration of calm, and the quiet rebuilding of connection. And I reflected on the lessons embedded in this process, that patience, foresight, observation, and emotional regulation are not merely abstract concepts, but essential tools in navigating the complexities of shared life. And that even when trust is momentarily compromised, deliberate, thoughtful, and empathetic engagement can restore clarity, respect, and mutual understanding. And I allowed myself to sit with the depth of the experience, the mixture of hurt, vulnerability, and eventual recognition, knowing that the turning point had revealed both the fragility and resilience of our partnership, and that the choices we made in response would define the trajectory of our relationships moving forward. And I also reflected on the emotional lessons for the children, how witnessing calm, deliberate handling of conflict, acknowledgement of mistakes, and restoration of trust teaches resilience, emotional intelligence, and the importance of communication in relationships. And I observed the subtle ways in which our daily rhythms began to normalize, how conversations regained a sense of ease, how laughter returned to the home, tempered now with a deeper understanding of boundaries, respect, and mutual accountability. And I felt a quiet pride in my own ability to navigate the situation with composure, insight, and care, knowing that the years of patience, observation, and foresight had prepared me for this challenge, and that my response had reinforced the principles of trust, clarity, and emotional integrity that I valued most. And I reflected on the broader implications for our shared life, the ways in which trust is both fragile and reparable, how communication can bridge gaps created by oversight or misjudgment, and how acknowledgement, transparency, and deliberate attention to one another's efforts maintain the foundation of partnership. And I allowed myself to experience the emotional release of having confronted the situation thoughtfully, feeling both the relief and the lingering awareness of the lessons learned. And I noticed how the small routines of daily life began to carry a renewed sense of purpose and care, the quiet rituals of shared responsibility, communication, and mutual acknowledgement taking on new significance. And I reflected on the personal growth embedded in this process, how patience, observance, clarity helped me deepen my resilience, emotional intelligence, and capacity for measured engagement. And I recognized that this moment, though difficult, had the potential to strengthen relationships, reinforce boundaries, and cultivate a deeper mutual understanding. And as I continued to process, I observed the subtle ways in which our household returned to equilibrium, the balance restored not through avoidance or forgetting, but through conscious acknowledgement, dialogue, and measured action. And I allowed myself to sit with the quiet satisfaction of having addressed a complex, emotionally charged situation with calm insight, and integrity. Knowing that the turning point had been navigated not with anger, haste, or reactivity, but with the deliberate application of patience, empathy, observation, and foresight. And I reflected on the enduring lessons that trust, respect, and acknowledgement are cultivated through consistent, thoughtful action, that even moments of breach can become opportunities for growth, understanding, and restored harmony, and that measured, emotionally informed engagement is the key to navigating the most difficult and delicate moments in shared life. And I felt a quiet resolve that, moving forward, the principles learned in this turning point would guide both my actions and my approach to relationships, finances, and emotional dynamics, reinforcing the foundation of partnership and family, and shaping the path towards resolution, healing, and renewed understanding. And as I sat with these reflections, I felt both the weight of the experience and the quiet assurance that thoughtful, deliberate, and compassionate navigation of conflict had not only addressed the immediate breach, but had strengthened the skills, insight, and emotional resilience that would guide me through all challenges yet to come.
In the days following the turning point, a quiet sense of reflection settled over the household, a space where the weight of earlier tension began to transform into understanding. And I noticed the subtle shifts in our interactions, the careful attention to clarity in communication, the deliberate pauses to ensure that emotions were acknowledged without being amplified unnecessarily. And I reflected on the lessons embedded in those moments, how the breach of trust over the $20,000 had illuminated deeper patterns of assumption, expectation, and unspoken agreements that had quietly structured our shared life. And I observed my own responses with a sense of calm awareness, recognizing that the ability to remain composed, thoughtful, and patient had allowed the conversation and subsequent actions to unfold with clarity and integrity. And I noticed how the children, sensitive to both tension and resolution, began to exhibit signs of reassurance, their behaviors reflecting the gradual restoration of emotional balance. And I reflected on the importance of modeling patience, acknowledgement, and deliberate engagement, understanding that their observations of how conflict is navigated would shape their understanding of trust, respect, and emotional intelligence. And I considered the quiet moments in which my husband and I worked to rebuild clarity, trust, and shared understanding, discussing finances, responsibilities, and expectations with deliberate honesty and attention. And I realized that these conversations, though challenging, were instrumental in restoring a sense of equilibrium, reinforcing boundaries, and affirming the value of transparency and mutual recognition. And I observed the subtle emotional transformations within myself, the relief of having addressed the breach with calm and clarity, the quiet satisfaction of having guided the situation toward constructive resolution, and the growing awareness of my own resilience, insight, and capacity for measured, empathetic engagement. And I reflected on the practical steps we took together to prevent future misunderstandings, establishing clearer agreements on finances, shared responsibilities, and communication practices. And I noticed how these small but deliberate measures contributed to a renewed sense of partnership, security, and mutual respect. And I allowed myself to acknowledge the emotional journey, the blend of disappointment, hurt, and subtle fear that had been present, and the ways in which deliberate action, thoughtful communication, and patient reflection had transformed that tension into growth, understanding, and restored connection. And I reflected on the personal lessons embedded in this experience, how the quiet cultivation of observation, patience, and foresight had prepared me to navigate not only practical challenges, but also complex emotional dynamics. And I noticed the slow restoration of ordinary rhythms within our household, the gentle resumption of shared routines, the laughter that returned, tempered with new awareness, and the small, meaningful interactions that carried a renewed sense of care, attentiveness, and mutual acknowledgement. And I observed the subtle ways in which our bond had been strengthened through deliberate engagement, the quiet commitment to respect, transparency, and recognition, serving as a foundation for future challenges. And I reflected on how the emotional landscape of our home had shifted, the tension replaced by calm, awareness, and deliberate care. The previous sense of fragility transformed into resilience, insight, and shared responsibility. And I considered the broader significance of this resolution, the ways in which navigating conflict with composure, empathy, and careful thought restores not only practical order, but emotional stability,
trust, and mutual understanding. And I felt a growing sense of gratitude for the capacity to engage with challenges in a way that honors both my own efforts and the partnership we had cultivated over years. And I allowed myself to experience the quiet relief of restoration, the recognition that the path forward was guided by clarity, patience, and mutual acknowledgement. And I reflected on the ongoing responsibility to maintain these principles, to continue observing, communicating, and engaging thoughtfully, and to ensure that trust, respect, and shared understanding remain central to our shared life. And I observed the subtle signs of healing, the way conversations flowed with renewed openness, the laughter that returned with warmth and authenticity, and the sense of calm attentiveness in small routines that had previously been taken for granted. And I allowed myself to sit with these reflections, feeling both the weight of the past breach and the quiet assurance that thoughtful, measured, and empathetic engagement had transformed the challenge into an opportunity for growth, learning, and strengthened relationships. And I recognized the ways in which my own preparation, reflection, and composure had shaped the resolution, providing a model of patience, foresight, and emotional intelligence that would continue to guide my responses to challenges. And I noticed how the home itself seemed to breathe more easily, the subtle rhythms of daily life reflecting the emotional restoration, the careful attention to mutual recognition, and the deliberate steps toward clarity and understanding. And I felt a quiet confidence in our ability to navigate future difficulties, knowing that the lessons learned in this experience about trust, communication, acknowledgement, and patient engagement would remain embedded in the fabric of our shared life, shaping interactions, reinforcing boundaries, and sustaining both emotional and practical harmony. And I reflected on the profound emotional depth of this resolution, how disappointment and hurt had been transformed through deliberate action, thoughtful dialogue, and measured reflection, and how the careful attention to emotional integrity, composure, and empathy had guided the process toward restoration and understanding. And I allowed myself to feel both the lingering awareness of the challenge and the quiet satisfaction of having navigated it with care, patience, and clarity, recognizing that the turning point, though difficult, had become an opportunity for growth, strengthened bonds, and renewed trust. And as I continued to process, I observed the subtle emotional transformations within my husband, the quiet acknowledgement, the tentative but sincere expressions of understanding and collaboration, and the gradual restoration of trust and collaboration. And I reflected on the enduring lessons for both of us, the importance of transparency, recognition, and thoughtful engagement in maintaining the health of our partnership. And I allowed myself to integrate the emotional insights gained, understanding that even challenging moments, when approached with patience, empathy, and clarity, can reinforce the foundations of trust, mutual respect, and shared life. And I noticed the quiet sense of hope that emerged, the awareness that the future was shaped not only by events, but by the deliberate, thoughtful, and emotionally informed responses we bring to them. And I felt the subtle comfort of equilibrium, the reassurance that patience, reflection, and integrity guide us through challenges. And I reflected on how this resolution had deepened my understanding of emotional resilience, the quiet power of careful observation, and the value of deliberate, thoughtful communication in navigating life's complexities. And I allowed myself to sit with the calm, the quiet acknowledgement of both the struggle and the restoration, the satisfaction of having addressed a difficult situation with grace, and the quiet hope that the lessons learned would continue to shape our life together in meaningful and enduring ways. And as the resolution continued to unfold, the emotional atmosphere in our home shifted subtly, yet profoundly. The quiet acknowledgement of mistakes and deliberate steps toward restoration created a sense of balance, understanding, and renewed connection. And I noticed how each interaction, once tinged with hesitation or unspoken tension, now carried a renewed openness, a careful attention to both words and emotions. And I reflected on the ways in which this process had strengthened my own capacity for patience, observation, and thoughtful engagement, understanding that true resolution is rarely immediate, but cultivated through repeated, deliberate acts of clarity, empathy, and recognition. And I observed the small but meaningful changes in my husband's demeanor, the gentle attentiveness in his responses, the subtle acknowledgement of both the impact of his actions and the effort I had invested in preserving the integrity of our shared life. And I allowed myself to recognize the profound significance of these shifts, how deliberate communication and patient reflection had transformed a moment of breach and disappointment into an opportunity for growth, understanding, and deepened trust. And I considered the impact on the children, how witnessing calm, thoughtful handling of conflict taught resilience, the importance of acknowledging mistakes, and the value of measured, empathetic responses. And I observed their behavior gradually returning to normal rhythms, the laughter and warmth in their interactions reflecting the restoration of emotional equilibrium in our household. And I felt a quiet satisfaction in seeing the subtle ways in which the family dynamics were healing, each carefully managed conversation and deliberate engagement contributing to the broader restoration of trust, balance, and emotional clarity. And I reflected on the practical measures we had implemented, establishing transparent agreements regarding finances, shared responsibilities, and ongoing communication. And I noticed how these actions, though simple, carried significant emotional weight, reinforcing boundaries, respect, and mutual recognition. And I allowed myself to process the depth of the experience, the mixture of disappointment, vulnerability, and subtle fear giving way to clarity, calm, and a renewed sense of confidence in our partnership. And I observed the emotional landscape with care, noting the subtle transformations, the quiet strengthening of bonds, and the way the careful navigation of the turning point had illuminated both challenges and opportunities for growth. And I reflected on my own internal journey, the patient observation, deliberate reflection, and measured engagement that had guided my responses, allowing me to navigate a complex emotional situation without succumbing to reactive emotions. And I noticed how these qualities, patience, foresight, emotional regulation, and empathy, had not only resolved the immediate breach, but provided enduring lessons for handling future challenges with clarity, integrity, and composure. And I allowed myself to acknowledge both the difficulty and the profound value of this experience.
Understanding that navigating conflict, disappointment, and breach with emotional intelligence strengthens not only relationships, but also personal resilience, insight, and capacity for thoughtful engagement. And I observed the subtle normalization of daily life, the routines that had once been disrupted now carrying a quiet sense of purpose, attentiveness, and mutual understanding. And I reflected on the ways in which these restored patterns reinforced trust, respect, and emotional equilibrium, and how each deliberate, thoughtful interaction contributed to sustaining the foundation of our partnership and household. And I considered the broader lessons, how trust, acknowledgement, and communication are cultivated and maintained through repeated, deliberate attention, and how even moments of challenge can become catalysts for growth, understanding, and strengthened bonds. And I noticed the gentle but meaningful gestures of care and recognition, the quiet attentiveness in conversations, the willingness to listen and acknowledge perspectives, and the subtle reinforcement of respect, all of which demonstrated the ongoing commitment to nurturing our shared life. And I allowed myself to integrate these reflections, recognizing the delicate interplay between action, communication, and emotional awareness in maintaining relationships. And I observed the renewed sense of confidence and calm within myself, the quiet satisfaction of having guided the resolution with patience, insight, and deliberate thought. And I reflected on the enduring impact of this experience, how it had deepened my understanding of trust, acknowledgement, and the importance of measured, empathetic engagement, and how it had strengthened both practical and emotional aspects of our partnership. And I noticed the subtle emotional transformations, the increased attentiveness, the quiet patience, and the deeper appreciation for the importance of transparency and mutual recognition. And I allowed myself to feel the relief and calm that comes with restored equilibrium, understanding that the lessons learned through this challenge would continue to shape our responses, communication, and shared life. And I reflected on the ways in which the family, though tested, had demonstrated resilience, adaptability, and capacity for growth. And I observed the gentle rebuilding of connection, trust, and emotional stability, and I allowed myself to sit with these observations, feeling both the weight of the earlier breach and the quiet satisfaction of having navigated it with integrity, patience, and insight. And I considered the subtle but powerful reinforcement of values, trust, empathy, transparency, and deliberate engagement that now guided our interactions. And I reflected on the emotional depth of the resolution, how deliberate, thoughtful, and empathetic engagement had transformed disappointment into understanding, vulnerability into connection, and tension into restored harmony. And I noticed how these lessons extended beyond the immediate household, shaping perspectives on communication, partnership, and emotional awareness.
And I allowed myself to experience a quiet sense of hope, reassurance, and confidence in the principles that had guided the restoration. And I reflected on the lasting significance of this period, understanding that navigating conflict with calm, clarity, and empathy not only addresses immediate challenges, but also fortifies relationships against future strain. And I observed the continued normalization of household rhythms, the restoration of laughter, warmth, and meaningful connection. And I allowed myself to feel the quiet gratitude for having navigated this turning point with patience, foresight, and emotional intelligence, recognizing that the lessons learned, the boundaries reinforced, and the trust rebuilt would guide our family toward a more stable, compassionate, and resilient future. And I reflected on the subtle but enduring transformation within myself and my relationships, understanding that even moments of tension and disappointment, when approached thoughtfully and empathetically, offer profound opportunities for growth, connection, and the reaffirmation of the values that sustain love, partnership, and family. And I allowed myself to sit with this sense of calm, clarity, and renewed hope, feeling the quiet assurance that the emotional, practical, and relational lessons of this experience would continue to guide our lives with integrity, understanding, and enduring care.
As the days and weeks passed following the resolution, a gentle sense of calm settled over our home, a quiet rhythm of ordinary life infused with the lessons and insights gained from the recent challenges, and I noticed how even the smallest interactions carried a renewed sense of care, attentiveness, and mutual respect. The laughter that returned to our home now imbued with subtle gratitude and awareness of the fragility and resilience of trust. And I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this place, the months of quiet observation, careful reflection, measured conversations, and deliberate actions that had guided us through a turning point that initially felt overwhelming and destabilizing. And I allowed myself to acknowledge the emotional growth that had occurred within me, the strengthening of patience, composure, empathy, and foresight, and the capacity to navigate difficult moments without reactionary anger, blame, or haste. And I observed the subtle ways in which my husband and children had also absorbed the lessons, demonstrating attentiveness, awareness, and care in their actions and words. And I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction in seeing the emotional equilibrium restored, the trust rebuilt, and the family bond strengthened not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through consistent, deliberate, and thoughtful engagement. And I reflected on the profound life lesson embedded in the experience, that challenges, breaches of trust, and moments of disappointment are not solely obstacles to overcome, but opportunities for growth, understanding, and the reaffirmation of values that sustain relationships. And I noticed the subtle changes in daily routines, the quiet attentiveness to shared responsibilities, the open communication, and the mutual acknowledgement of effort and care, all of which reinforced the foundation of partnership and family life. And I allowed myself to feel the weight of this transformation, the awareness that patience, clarity, empathy, and integrity are not only principles, but practical tools for navigating the complexities of shared life. And I considered the ways in which this experience had reshaped my understanding of trust, the fragility of unspoken assumptions, and the power of deliberate acknowledgement. And I reflected on the importance of integrating these lessons into ongoing life, ensuring that even ordinary moments are infused with awareness, respect, and care. And I noticed the subtle emotional shifts within myself, a growing confidence in my ability to respond thoughtfully to challenges, to maintain clarity and composure in difficult moments, and to guide interactions toward constructive, restorative outcomes. And I observed the gentle evolution of the family dynamic, the quiet reassurance in gestures, words, and routines that indicated restored connection. And I reflected on how deliberate engagement, patient communication, and empathetic attention can transform the aftermath of conflict into strengthened bonds. And I allowed myself to consider the broader implications, how this experience would shape future interactions, conversations, and decisions, guiding not only practical matters like finances and responsibilities, but also the deeper currents of trust, acknowledgement, and emotional security. And I felt a quiet gratitude for the capacity to navigate difficult emotional terrain, for the insights gained through reflection, and for the opportunity to model resilience, composure, and thoughtful engagement for the children. And I noticed the subtle ways in which they observed, absorbed, and integrated these lessons, learning from the calm, measured responses of those they trust and rely on. And I allowed myself to acknowledge the emotional depth of these lessons, the ways in which trust, transparency, and mutual recognition sustain relationships over time, and the subtle power of empathy, patience, and integrity in guiding both immediate and long-term responses. And I reflected on the quiet reassurance of restored equilibrium, the sense that challenges, even those that feel destabilizing, can ultimately reinforce connection, insight, and understanding. And I observed the ongoing attention required to maintain this equilibrium,
the importance of consistent communication, acknowledgement, and attentiveness, and I allowed myself to sit with a sense of calm satisfaction, recognizing that the lessons learned, the boundaries reinforced, and the trust rebuilt had created a more resilient, compassionate, and connected family dynamic. And I considered the subtle but enduring impact of deliberate, thoughtful engagement, the ways in which it shapes not only immediate resolution, but also the long-term health, stability, and harmony of relationships. And I reflected on the importance of internal awareness, the cultivation of patience, foresight, and emotional regulation, and the ability to navigate complex situations without succumbing to reactive emotion. And I allowed myself to feel the quiet relief of seeing the home and family returning to balance, the subtle joy of laughter, conversation, and shared routines infused with new understanding, and the reassurance that careful, empathetic handling of challenges restores both practical order and emotional well-being. And I observed the enduring effects on our household, the strengthened bonds, the clearer communication, and the mutual recognition that sustain both daily life and long-term relationships. And I reflected on the broader moral embedded in the experience, the understanding that even difficult, painful, or challenging moments can become catalysts for growth, understanding, and renewed trust when approached with patience, clarity, empathy, and deliberate thought. And I allowed myself to integrate these lessons into the fabric of daily life, understanding that the principles of acknowledgement, transparency, and measured engagement are not abstract concepts, but practical tools for sustaining healthy, resilient, and emotionally secure relationships. And I noticed the subtle emotional shifts within myself, a growing confidence in my ability to respond thoughtfully to challenges, to maintain clarity and composure in difficult moments, and to guide interactions toward constructive, restorative outcomes. And I allowed myself to sit with the quiet warmth of understanding, gratitude, and hope, feeling both the weight of the past challenges and the assurance that measured, empathetic, and deliberate engagement would guide the family through future difficulties. And I considered the ongoing responsibility to nurture these principles, to continue modeling patience, observation, and emotional awareness, and to cultivate trust, transparency, and mutual acknowledgement in every interaction. And I reflected on the enduring significance of these lessons for both myself and the family, the subtle ways in which they shape relationships, influence behaviors, and foster resilience. And I allowed myself to feel a sense of quiet completion, the calm recognition that the journey through challenge, breach, and resolution had not only addressed immediate difficulties, but reinforced the values, understanding, and emotional integrity that sustain long-term connection. And I observed the household settling into a steady, harmonious rhythm, the laughter, warmth, and attentiveness restored. And I reflected on the quiet joy of ordinary moments, now carrying the weight and insight of lessons learned. And I allowed myself to sit with the reassurance that patience, foresight, empathy, and deliberate engagement would continue to guide our life together, fostering resilience, trust, and the enduring bonds that define family, partnership, and shared life. And I felt a gentle hope, a calm confidence, and a heartfelt understanding that the lessons of this journey would remain with us, shaping our interactions, decisions, and relationships in meaningful and lasting ways, guiding both present and future moments with clarity, integrity, and quiet emotional strength.